Hey guys, tonight we begin with The Last Vestal Virgin, a bedtime story of duty, quiet rituals, and the sacred flames of Rome. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan, just for that soft background hum. Find a cozy spot, sink into it, and let your shoulders relax. Tonight, we're stepping back, far back, to ancient Rome, where marble temples rose under the stars, and a sacred flame burned for centuries without pause. This is the story of the women who guarded that flame, the Vestal Virgins, and of the very last one who watched the light of 1,000 years slowly fade into history. So, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine walking into ancient Rome. The streets are quieter than you might expect. Not the noisy markets or the clamor of soldiers we usually picture, but the Rome of early dawn. Marble walls glimmer faintly in the first light, and a cool mist curls around the temples. The city seems to breathe in silence, waiting for the day to begin. At the very heart of Rome, near the Grand Forum, stood a temple unlike any other, round, simple, but sacred beyond measure. This was the Temple of Vesta. Inside it, a single flame burned endlessly. It was said that as long as this flame was alive, Rome itself would live. The fire was more than just light. It was hope. It was protection. It was the heartbeat of an empire. But the flame did not tend itself. It was watched over, cared for, and protected by women known as the Vestal Virgins. To the Romans, they were living symbols of purity and duty. And to every passerby, the sight of their white robes brought reassurance that Rome's spirit was safe. The city moved around them. Merchants opened their stalls. Children laughed in the streets. Senators debated in the forum. Yet inside the temple, time felt different. Still, steady, almost eternal. The quiet crackle of the fire reminded all who entered that some things must never be broken. As you picture it now, think of the glow of that fire against smooth marble walls, the soft footsteps of sandaled feet, the faint smell of smoke and oil in the air. It was a world of ritual, of silence, of faith. And within this sacred stillness, the story of one young girl begins. A girl chosen to leave behind the familiar warmth of her family, to step into the timeless duty of keeping Rome's flame alive. She did not yet know that she would one day become the last to guard it. But tonight, we start at the beginning, in a city where eternal fires glowed against the darkness, and the fate of Rome itself was thought to rest on their light. As we leave behind the glowing temple at the heart of Rome, imagine the city's life unfolding just beyond its steps. The cries of merchants rise with the sun, wheels of wooden carts rumble across stone roads, and laughter of children echoes between the marble walls. Yet somewhere in a quiet Roman villa, away from all this noise, a decision is being made that will change a young girl's life forever. She is perhaps only 6, maybe 7 years old. Her hair is neatly braided, her eyes wide with curiosity, though she does not fully understand what is about to happen. She has been chosen by fate and by the priests of Rome, to serve the goddess Vesta. For her family, this is both an honor and a sorrow. To give a daughter to the service of the goddess is to give her to the city itself. She will no longer belong to them in the ordinary way. No father will arrange her marriage. No mother will prepare her dowry. Her path will be different, quieter, stricter, and yet, in the eyes of Rome, higher than most could ever dream. Picture the moment she walks through the streets toward the house of the Vestals for the very first time. The people step aside as she passes, whispering in low voices, some in awe, some in pity. Dressed in white, she looks almost like a small flame herself, fragile, yet untouchable. The temple doors open, and the world of her childhood slowly falls away behind her. From this day forward, her life will be bound to silence, to discipline, and to ritual. She will no longer run freely in gardens or sit at her mother's side. Instead, she will rise with the dawn to tend to sacred duties, her every step watched by the city, her every choice measured against the weight of Rome's survival. And yet, there is a strange calmness in her heart. Though she does not yet grasp the fullness of what lies ahead, she feels the pull of the sacred fire, the soft crackle of its warmth, calling to her like a promise. In her innocence, she accepts the path laid before her, without protest, without tears. The people of Rome see her as chosen, touched by the divine, but she is still just a child, stepping quietly into a destiny she did not ask for, yet cannot refuse. And so begins her life as a Vestal Virgin, a silent path of devotion, woven with rituals, prayers, and the unyielding glow of an eternal flame. The little girl has stepped away from her family, from the familiar warmth of home, and into a place unlike any she has ever known, the house of the Vestals. Imagine walking through its gates with her, wide marble walls rising on either side, protecting a world of silence and devotion within. It is not only a house, but almost a sanctuary, a place hidden from the restless noise of Rome, where time seems to slow. The air is cooler here. The pathways are lined with shaded gardens, where fountains trickle softly and vines curl along the stone. Olive trees sway gently, their leaves whispering with every passing breeze. There is a stillness, a peace, but also a weight, the kind of quiet that reminds you that every step, every gesture, is being watched by history itself. Inside the long hallways, voices are low. The other Vestals move gracefully in white robes, their steps careful and deliberate, as though the floor itself listens. Each one carries an air of dignity, but also of distance. They are sisters in duty, yet bound more by silence than by laughter. For the young girl, this new home feels both comforting and overwhelming. There are rooms filled with sacred tools, bronze vessels polished until they gleam, shelves of scrolls and ritual objects carefully kept in order. She notices the patterns of daily life, the older Vestals guiding the younger, teaching them how to tend the sacred fire, how to perform prayers with precision, how to walk with the serenity expected of them. At night, when the city outside grows restless, and the forum fills with the hum of taverns and soldiers, the house of the Vestals remains calm. Lamps flicker along its corridors, casting golden pools of light against the walls. The silence here is not empty. It is sacred, purposeful, almost alive. And in the center of it all lies the most important bond, the flame of Vesta, glowing steadily in the temple just beyond their home. Every girl who enters this house learns quickly that her life is no longer her own. It belongs to Rome, to the fire, to the goddess whose presence is said to live in its glow. Still, there are moments, small and quiet, where she finds comfort. The soft cooing of doves in the courtyard, the cool touch of marble under her hand, the gentle murmur of the fountain at dusk. These little details, so delicate and human, become the threads that help her weave herself into this new life. The house of the Vestals is not only her home now, it is her world, and soon she will discover the true heart of this world, the sacred flame itself, the fire that never dies, and the reason why her every breath, her every prayer, must be given to its keeping. In the quiet heart of the Vestals' world, beyond the shaded courtyards and marble corridors, stood the small round temple that held Rome's most precious treasure. The child who had only just entered her new life was now brought here, led by the elder priestesses, her steps hushed as though the very stones beneath her feet demanded reverence. Within those walls the air felt different, warmer, alive, and touched with the faint scent of smoke and oil. At the center of the temple burned the sacred flame of Vesta, steady and unwavering. It was not large, not wild, but constant, a golden glow that softened the shadows and seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Rome itself. For the Vestals, this fire was more than a flame. It was the life of the city. To them, every spark carried meaning. If it ever went out, it was said Rome would fall into ruin. And so, through centuries, the flame was never left alone, never forgotten, never allowed to fade. The girl watched quietly as the elder Vestals moved with careful grace. Their hands tended the fire with small offerings of wood, their lips murmuring prayers so softly they seemed to merge with the crackle of the flame. Each gesture was measured, each step part of a ritual that had been repeated for generations. As she stood there, the warmth of the fire touched her face. She felt its glow seep into her, not as heat, but as a presence, steady, unyielding, eternal. It was both comforting and overwhelming, a reminder that her life was now tied to something far greater than herself. Day after day, she would return to this place, sometimes at dawn, when the city still slept under the hush of morning light, sometimes at night, when the stars hung over Rome and the temple stood in stillness, the fire its only heartbeat. The rhythm of tending, watching, and guarding became the rhythm of her own life. The people of Rome believed this fire protected them all, and so, when they saw the Vestals in their white robes, they bowed their heads, knowing these women carried a burden no one else could bear. For the young Vestal, the flame was both a duty and a mystery. She could not yet grasp the full weight of her vows, but she understood this much, that as long as the fire burned, she too must remain devoted, silent, and steadfast. And so her days unfolded in a cycle of ritual and reverence, always circling back to that quiet glowing fire at the center of her world. But tending the flame was only one part of her life. Beyond the temple lay a stricter path, one of vows and unbroken discipline, where purity and duty were demanded without exception. The fire burned on, steady and unyielding, and with it, the life of the young Vestal began to take shape. Each day was no longer her own. From the moment she rose at dawn to the time she rested under the flicker of lamplight, her hours followed a rhythm woven with vows, rituals, and the constant reminder of her duty. To serve as a Vestal virgin was to live within strict boundaries. She had taken vows of purity, binding her to a life without marriage, without children, without the comforts most Roman women would one day know. Her body, her thoughts, her very presence were considered sacred, belonging not to herself, but to the goddess Vesta, and through her, to Rome itself. The discipline was absolute. A misstep in a ritual, a moment of neglect, or even the faintest whisper of scandal could bring disgrace, not only to her, but to the city she served. The people of Rome revered the Vestals, yet they also expected perfection. And so the young girl learned early that her every action carried weight, that silence, restraint, and obedience were as much her companions as the sisters who lived beside her. But duty was not only burden, it was also a strange kind of freedom. Unlike most women of Rome, who were bound to husbands or households, the Vestals moved with a rare independence. They were honored guests at ceremonies, given seats of dignity at games and festivals, and their words carried authority even senators respected. It was a life of limits, yet also one of quiet power. The young Vestal began to find comfort in routine. The turning of seasons marked her days. Spring festivals, summer offerings, autumn prayers, winter vigils. Her voice joined in chants that had echoed for centuries. Her hands repeated gestures worn smooth by generations before her. Little by little, she became a part of the long, unbroken chain of service that stretched back to Rome's earliest days. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed heavily on her shoulders. She was still only a girl, after all, and the laughter of children in the streets sometimes stirred a quiet ache within her. Yet when she stood before the sacred fire, watching its glow reflect in her eyes, That ache softened into something else, a quiet pride perhaps, or a peace that came from knowing her life carried meaning beyond herself. Her path was narrow, yes, but it was steady, and in the stillness of her vows, she found a strength she had not known she possessed. This was the essence of her life now: purity, discipline, and duty, interwoven with reverence. A flame within her, just as steady as the one she guarded, had begun to take hold, and with each passing dawn, her days began not only with duty, but with ritual, as the first light of morning carried her gently back to the temple once more. The vows of purity and duty shaped her life, but it was in the quiet rhythm of morning that those vows truly began each day. Long before the streets of Rome stirred with footsteps, before merchants opened their stalls and voices filled the forum, the Vestal virgins were already awake, wrapped in the stillness of dawn. The young Vestal would rise from her simple bed, her robe gathered neatly around her shoulders, and step into the cool corridors of the house. Lamps still flickered faintly along the walls, their glow mingling with the pale light of the rising sun. The air carried a hush, broken only by the gentle cooing of doves in the courtyard. Her first steps led not to food or comfort, but to duty. Together with her sisters, she walked the short path to the temple of Vesta. Their movements were unhurried, yet purposeful, as though each step was part of an ancient prayer. When they entered, the sacred flame was never alone, but at dawn, it seemed to glow with a special softness, its light greeting the first rays of morning. The ritual was simple in form, yet profound in meaning. A small offering of wood, a sprinkle of grain, the soft murmur of prayer. Hands moved with precision, gestures repeated exactly as they had been for centuries. No word was wasted, no movement rushed. In that quiet moment, the world beyond the temple, the noise of the markets, the shouts of soldiers, even the power struggles of emperors, felt distant, almost unreal. The dawn belonged to the Vestals. And so, day after day, the young girl learned to begin her life in harmony with this sacred rhythm. The crackle of fire, the faint scent of smoke, the soft brush of robes against stone, these became the music of her mornings. They reminded her that she was no longer simply herself, but part of something greater, something unbroken, something eternal. After the flame was tended and the prayers complete, the Vestals would often remain for a time, standing in the glow of the fire as the city awakened beyond the temple walls. There was a calmness in these pauses, as though the very act of waiting, of standing still in reverence, carried its own meaning. For the young Vestal, these mornings became the foundation of her strength. The rituals anchored her, shaping her days with quiet certainty. And though her path was strict, she found a strange comfort in its repetition. The way each dawn began the same, yet felt fresh, as if the fire itself renewed her spirit. It was in these rituals that she first began to understand what it meant to truly serve, not through grand gestures, but through small, unwavering acts, carried out with devotion and care. And while the mornings were filled with sacred quiet, the world beyond the temple was never far away. Rome was a city alive with whispers, and for those who wore the white robes of Vesta, the streets carried both reverence and rumor. Morning rituals gave the Vestals strength, but once they stepped beyond the temple walls, another world awaited them, a world where every gaze lingered a little too long, and every whisper carried weight. In the crowded streets of Rome, the Vestal virgins were not just priestesses. They were symbols. Their white robes, their braided hair, and the small tokens of their sacred office made them unmistakable. Wherever they walked, people moved aside. Some lowered their eyes in reverence. Others bowed their heads. A few, however, watched with a kind of hushed curiosity, as though trying to glimpse what secrets might hide behind the calm faces of these women. For the young Vestal, the city felt both familiar and strange. She had once walked these streets as a child, holding her mother's hand, unnoticed in the crowd. Now every step was different. The merchants selling olives and bread paused to watch her pass. Soldiers standing guard shifted their spears in salute. Even senators, men of great power, nodded respectfully as she crossed their path. It was a life touched by privilege, yet also by distance. For though the people revered the Vestals, they also feared them in a way. To speak ill of a Vestal was dangerous. To harm one was unthinkable. The Romans believed that their lives were bound to the fate of the city. To insult a Vestal was to invite misfortune on all of Rome. Still, there were whispers. Some wondered what truly happened behind the marble walls of the house of the Vestals. Others questioned if the young women ever longed for freedom, or if they felt the weight of vows too heavy for their shoulders. These whispers were quiet, never spoken loudly, but they drifted through the city like smoke, never solid, never vanishing completely. For the Vestal herself, walking through these streets was a constant reminder of her place. She was honored, yes, but never truly ordinary. She could not laugh freely in the marketplace, could not linger with friends, could not let herself blend into the crowd. Every movement, every glance was part of her role. She was both present and apart, admired from afar, yet never fully touched by the life around her. As she returned each evening to the safety of the house of the Vestals, the whispers of the city followed behind her like shadows. Respect and rumor, awe and curiosity, they all tangled together, shaping how the people saw her and how she slowly began to see herself. Life in Rome was never without noise, never without eyes watching, and for those who bore the sacred duty of Vesta, the streets themselves were a reminder that devotion was not lived in silence alone, but under the gaze of an entire empire. And yet beyond the city's watchful eyes, there were moments of brightness too, festivals that filled the air with music, processions that carried joy through the streets, and days when the Vestals stepped out not as distant figures, but as honored participants in the life of Rome. The whispers of Rome's streets followed the Vestals wherever they went, yet there were times when the quiet distance between them and the people dissolved, and the city welcomed them with open reverence. These were the days of festivals, when Rome itself seemed to shine a little brighter. The calendar of the city was marked by sacred celebrations, and none were more closely tied to the Vestals than the festivals of Vesta herself. On those mornings, the air carried a different kind of energy. Streets were swept clean, garlands of flowers hung from doorways, and the people gathered in anticipation of the processions that would soon pass. For the young Vestal, stepping into these festivals felt unlike her usual walks through the city. The eyes of the people were still upon her, but this time they shone with joy, not curiosity. Children pointed eagerly, tugging at their mothers' sleeves to catch a glimpse of the white-robed women. Old men and women bowed deeply, as though the sight of the Vestals brought blessings into their lives. The ceremonies themselves were filled with color and rhythm. Musicians played flutes and drums, priests chanted in solemn tones, and offerings were carried to the temples. The Vestals moved in quiet procession, their faces serene, their steps measured, their presence a living part of the sacred spectacle. One of the most cherished moments came during the festival of Vestalia. On this day, the temple of Vesta, normally closed to all but the priestesses, was opened to Roman matrons. Mothers and daughters entered with reverence, bringing offerings of food and grain. For a brief time, the sacred flame was shared more closely with the people, its warmth felt by those who usually only saw it from afar. The young Vestal, standing beside the fire during such days, felt the bond between her duty and her city more deeply than ever. The flame was not only hers to guard, it was Rome's. Every face that turned toward it, every hand that laid down an offering, carried a hope, a prayer, a trust placed in her and her sisters. Yet, even amid the music and color, the Vestals remained apart in their own way. They did not join in the laughter of the crowds or dance to the rhythm of the drums. Their role was one of quiet dignity, steady and unshaken, like the flame they carried. When the festivals ended and the garlands faded, the Vestals returned once more to their house, stepping back into the stillness of marble halls and sacred duties. But for the young girl, those days left an echo, a reminder that her life of silence and devotion was not only for the temple walls, but for the countless lives touched by the flame she served. Festivals brought brightness to her world, yet when the celebrations faded, another truth always returned. Behind the public honor and quiet reverence, her life carried its own solitude, and in the silence of night, the weight of her vows often felt heavier than the cheers of any festival could lift. Night had fallen over Rome, and the sacred temple stood cloaked in silence. The great city that once roared with the sounds of merchants, soldiers, and chariots was now hushed, save for the faint rustle of the Tiber's waters in the distance. Inside the temple, the sacred flame flickered gently, its golden light dancing across marble walls. For centuries, it had burned without end, tended faithfully by the Vestal virgins. But now, whispers of doubt began to drift through the stillness. Cornelia, the last of the Vestals, stood by the fire with tired eyes. She had given her life to this duty, to guard the eternal flame, the heart of Rome. Yet, in the silence of night, a thought pressed heavily upon her. What if the flame no longer had meaning? What if its time had passed, like so many forgotten gods? Beyond the temple walls, shadows gathered. Not the shadows of ordinary night, but the shadows of change. The empire was not what it once had been. The streets were restless, the people divided, and the old gods were fading from memory. Rome itself seemed to be holding its breath, and Cornelia could feel it, that her sacred duty was no longer simply about tending fire, but about guarding the memory of an entire world slowly slipping away. She leaned closer to the flame, watching the way it bent and swayed as though it, too, was uncertain of its place in the world. The light warmed her face, but in the cold corners of the temple, the darkness seemed to creep closer, daring the fire to falter. Cornelia whispered a prayer, her voice trembling. "May you burn as long as Rome endures. May you not be forgotten, as I must never forget." But in her heart, she wondered, was she speaking to the gods or only to herself? And so, the night stretched on, with Cornelia standing watch between light and shadow, a lone figure, surrounded by the weight of duty and the whispers of change waiting just beyond the temple walls. The great city of Rome never truly slept. Even when darkness draped itself across the tiled rooftops and silent streets, the heart of the empire continued to beat quietly. Somewhere, a guard's footsteps echoed against stone. Somewhere else, the faint sound of a lute drifted through the air, carried by a wandering musician. But within the temple of Vesta, the world was different. It was hushed, still, almost timeless. The marble walls held the coolness of night, and the sacred flame shimmered gently, sending tiny sparks of golden light dancing across the floor. Tonight, it was Livia's turn to keep watch. She sat near the flame, her white robe flowing around her like ripples of water, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Outside, the moonlight filtered softly through the open roof above, bathing the room in silver. The fire and the moon seemed to speak to one another, two guardians of the night, one earthly, the other eternal. Livia listened carefully to the silence. It was not empty. No, silence in the temple was alive, filled with whispers of history, with voices of priestesses long gone, and with the quiet breath of the goddess herself. She imagined that if she stilled her heart enough, she could almost hear them. Soft, tender voices carried through the ages. Her eyes flickered toward the flame, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw shapes in the fire. A mother, a child, a city under the warmth of the sun. She blinked, and the visions melted away, leaving only the steady glow of the fire. Perhaps, she thought, this was the way the goddess spoke, through images hidden in the light. Outside, an owl called into the night, and Livia shivered slightly. She was young, after all, and though she carried herself with calm grace, moments like this reminded her of her humanity. The weight of duty pressed upon her, but so too did wonder, the kind of wonder that makes one realize how small we are beneath the vast sky, and how sacred even the simplest act can be. She leaned a little closer to the flame and whispered, though no one else could hear, "I will not fail you." And in that vow, spoken softly under the moonlight, her heart steadied. The fire seemed to flare for just a second, as though answering back. The Forum of Rome, with its white marble columns and grand temples, often seemed alive, as though the stones themselves carried the weight of centuries of voices. During the day, the place was filled with senators debating, merchants bargaining, and citizens sharing news. But at twilight, when shadows lengthened and the bustle quieted, the Forum felt different, softer, quieter, almost like a dream. It was in these quiet hours that our Vestal Virgin would sometimes walk, escorted by attendants, her steps light and measured. The hem of her white gown brushed against the marble floor as her eyes wandered over the statues and arches, each figure carved in stone, stern gods, triumphant generals, noble statesmen, seemed to whisper their stories into the cool evening air. Some whispers were bold, telling of Rome's victories and glories. Others were softer, carrying warnings of fragility, as if reminding her that empires, like flames, could flicker and fade. The young Vestal would pause often, her gaze lingering on the Temple of Saturn, the great treasury of Rome, and on the Senate House, where decisions that shaped the empire were made. She listened, not with her ears, but with her heart. In the silence, she felt the weight of Rome's history pressing gently upon her shoulders. It was as though the city itself trusted her to guard not only the sacred flame, but also its memory, its spirit. And yet, she was still a girl. Sometimes her thoughts wandered. She would imagine how different her life might have been, running through vineyards, laughing by the Tiber, or listening to lullabies sung by a mother she barely remembered. But those were only fleeting shadows, swept away by the reality of her vows. For here, in the marble halls of Rome, her duty was clear. She was a vessel of the divine, chosen to walk softly between the world of mortals and the eternal will of the gods. The whispers of the Forum seemed to embrace her as she walked back toward the temple, the fading light painting golden streaks across the marble. And in that moment, she understood. The city itself was alive, and she was part of its quiet breath, its heartbeat, its memory. The flame had burned for centuries, steady, unwavering, and eternal. Yet in the quiet corners of the temple, whispers began to stir. The world outside Rome's sacred walls was changing. Armies marched, emperors rose and fell, and beyond the marble steps of the Forum, the empire itself trembled beneath the weight of unrest. Within the house of the Vestals, life remained serene on the surface. The soft sweep of brooms, the echo of sandals across marble floors, the hum of daily prayers, all continued, as if untouched by time. But beneath this silence, unease lingered. The youngest Vestal sometimes caught her breath at night, listening to the distant shouts of soldiers or the hollow toll of warning bells echoing through the city. She would close her eyes, hoping the walls of the temple were strong enough to keep the chaos at bay. The older priestesses, though calm, carried the burden of foresight. They knew the fate of the empire could touch even this most sacred sanctuary. And while the sacred fire burned brightly, they understood its glow was no longer enough to shield them from the uncertainty pressing against Rome's gates. Still, their duty was clear: to guard the flame, to protect the symbol that promised Rome's survival. Yet deep in their hearts, even they wondered, how long could one fire, however sacred, truly hold back the shadows of an empire crumbling around it. The night grew longer, the air heavy with tension, as if even the stars above held their breath. The Vestals prayed more fervently, whispered more quietly, and carried out each ritual with an intensity born not just of faith, but of fear. And so the temple stood, a fragile island of light in a sea of growing darkness, a place where silence carried both comfort and dread. The days passed slowly, and yet the air within Rome seemed heavier with each sunrise. The streets outside the temple walls no longer carried the same rhythm of laughter, music, and commerce. Instead, the voices of merchants were quieter, the footsteps of soldiers more hurried, and the anxious murmur of the people seemed to reach even the marble steps of the Vestal temple. Inside, the priestesses continued their rituals with unwavering devotion. The fire glowed gently, its golden light washing across the carved walls, reminding them of their duty. To any visitor, the temple still appeared serene, untouched by the troubles of the world beyond. But late at night, when the city fell into uneasy sleep, a faint tremor could sometimes be felt through the stone floors. Was it the shifting of the earth, or the marching of armies drawing closer? The younger Vestals whispered about it to one another, voices hushed, afraid that even their fears might weaken the flame. The eldest among them remained steady, her eyes calm though her heart, too, carried the weight of uncertainty. She reminded them gently, "Our task is not to control the world beyond these walls. Our task is to protect the fire that holds Rome together." Still, even she wondered, could their sacred flame survive if the empire itself faltered? Could light endure when shadows pressed so near? And so, each prayer grew longer, each offering more careful, as if every breath of devotion might weave a shield strong enough to hold back the tide. Outside, the empire rumbled like a distant storm. Inside, the temple stood firm, quiet, and glowing with its fragile but eternal promise. The Vestals carried on, but the tremor in the distance was growing closer. The day began as any other. The Vestal temple awoke with the hush of soft footsteps, the ringing of the bronze bell, and the steady, glowing heart of the sacred fire. Yet, beneath the calm rituals, there lingered an unease too strong to ignore. From beyond the temple walls, the sounds of Rome were different. The clatter of hooves, the distant roll of wheels, the cries of citizens moving quickly through the streets. Rumors had reached the city gates, rumors of enemies drawing closer, of legions weakened, of Rome no longer invincible. The younger priestesses tried not to listen, but their eyes betrayed their worry. Even the fire seemed to flicker more sharply that day, as though it too sensed the trembling of the world beyond. As dusk settled, the Vestals gathered in a circle around the hearth. They whispered prayers more urgently than before, their hands raised toward the flame. The eldest priestess spoke softly, her voice steady, but carrying a weight none could ignore. "This fire has lived through storms and wars, through triumph and despair, but it endures only if we endure. Do not let fear enter your hearts. Rome depends on this light." The flame burned brightly at her words, yet for a brief moment, a sudden draft swept through the chamber. The fire wavered, shrinking as if caught in doubt, before rising again. The priestesses gasped, their hearts pounding. Was it merely the wind, or had the tremor of Rome's fate reached even here, threatening the sacred flame? The temple returned to silence, but none of them slept peacefully that night. Each knew that the shadow pressing upon Rome was no longer distant. It was here, and for the first time, the Vestals began to wonder, what happens if the eternal fire goes out? It happened quietly, not with thunder or cries, but with a hush so deep it seemed the city itself held its breath. One cold night, as Rome wrestled with hunger and war, the sacred fire in the temple faltered. The Vestals gathered, their hands trembling, their prayers urgent. They fed the logs, whispered the ancient words, but the flame that had burned for centuries lowered, flickered, and at last disappeared into smoke. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the soft sound of weeping. The eternal fire, Rome's heartbeat, was gone. In the days that followed, some believed it was a sign that the gods had turned away. Others whispered that Rome had simply changed too much, that even the strongest traditions could not hold forever. The temple remained, its walls still standing, but without the warmth of the fire, it felt hollow, like a song without its melody. And yet, though the sacred flame no longer burned in Rome, its story did not die. Across time, people remembered the Vestals, the guardians who had kept watch for centuries. They remembered the fire that had once promised Rome eternity. Even now, when we speak of the eternal flame, we are reminded of that ancient promise, of light against darkness, of duty carried through generations, and of the fragile hope that keeps every civilization alive. The flame may have gone out, but the memory of it still glows, softly, like embers in the night. And as you close your eyes, perhaps you can imagine it, a single spark, burning gently, quietly, eternal in the stories we continue to tell.